I'm going to introduce Bob Page, who's come up from Boston. He's at the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation.
You got it.
Got it. All right. And this is kind of a reminder of the fact that the Park Service, and you got it with the culvert talk earlier this morning too. I mean, we're very much an interdisciplinary. We're very much interested in lots of different disciplines of science, so the cultural and natural resources as well as the facilities and other parts of the environment that we're interested in. So thank you very much, Bob.
Great. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here participating in the symposium to share a cultural resource management perspective on how changing environmental conditions are impacting decision-making regarding our national park landscapes. The Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation is part of the National Park Service, and we work to help parks preserve their cultural landscape resources, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And we do that through a variety of services. Most of our projects guide long-term preservation, and they're driven by a full spectrum of site management goals, such as public access and interpretation, preservation of natural resources, and contemporary use. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is draw upon project work through a variety of national parks. So it's unlike a specific project looking at one park and a research undertaking. It's really going to highlight what we're doing in a variety of parks to respond to change and to create hopefully long-term sustainable landscapes that we can manage within the context of preservation. As a custodian of the National Park System, as I know all of you know, the Park Service is steward of some of our most important natural and cultural resources, and is charged with preserving them unimpaired for the present and future generations. When we look at American history, we can find American history well represented in the National Park System, although it may not be the first thing that somebody thinks about when you say national parks. And this is especially true in the 79 parks in the Northeast region. The physical remains of this heritage that we're preserving as part of the system, we truly believe provide a powerful format to tell the story of our nation's history. And cultural landscapes are one of the primary vehicles for telling that history. Landscapes may reflect important events, activities, or persons, such as the Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg, or the presidential home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in New York. Cultural landscapes may reveal design trends, such as the formal residential grounds at Marsh-Billings Rockefeller National Historical Park in Vermont, or one of my favorite resources, a recreational motor road, such as the Loop Road here at Acadia. Many landscapes in the National Park System reflect vernacular patterns of early settlement and agricultural use, such as Baker Island, also here in Acadia. And finally, there are those landscapes that are extremely important and have extremely important ties to contemporary groups, such as Harriet Tubman Underground National Railroad Monument, located here in Maryland's Eastern Shore, one of our newest national park units. Cultural landscapes may be cherished for their beauty or utility, or for a host of other reasons, but it's their ability to connect one generation to another to some aspect of our shared history that may be their most valuable quality in telling the stories that can be found in our national parks. So with that variety of resources that we're managing, how do we preserve these special places in the context of environmental change? How do we respond to impacts of climate change and make our landscapes more resilient? There is a common perception that the primary goal of cultural resource management is to freeze a place in time. It is true that historic preservation is focused on retaining historic character and a high degree of authenticity, so that the place reveals its history and can be used as a teaching tool. However, there are a variety of factors that will result in change at some level and climate adaptation and landscape resilience increasingly are part of that list. From its infancy, the field of cultural landscape preservation has challenged the concept of freezing, a place and time. Given that almost all landscapes are comprised of natural systems, managing change is core to stewardship. Therefore, our challenge is in defining how change either contributes to or detracts from historic character. What change is desirable or compatible, and what change is adverse? To answer these questions, as we do in all science, we build a foundation for decision making. And that foundation documents a landscape's significance and its existing conditions. And our management approach will vary depending on the type of landscape we're looking to preserve. Through research and documentation, both large and small scale changes in the landscape can be revealed. For example, we can reveal this recently found, in the research we've done here at Acadia, 1873 U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey of Bar Harbor and the surrounding islands, with the same area today, and begin to document changes in forest patterns, settlement, and the coastline. If we look at a feature such as Big Meadows in Shenandoah National Park, we can compare aerial photographs taken in 1957 and 2009 and see that we are experiencing changes. The meadow is decreasing in size. The question is why? And is there a need to intervene? What is the process if this is an important cultural feature as part of Big Meadows? At a smaller scale feature level, we can look at the Rose Garden back at the home of FDR and compare existing conditions to historic and see the impacts of deer browsing to the perimeter hedge. We document this research in a variety of formats and through a variety of reports, again, to help guide ongoing management. A critical component to what we're documenting is in defining what are the elements that shape and define the historic character at this particular landscape. Given how it's influenced by dynamic qualities, how do we capture the overall intent and sense of place so that when a visitor comes to visit, they get to understand and experience the landscape and what it can convey? For example, at St. Gaudens National Historical Park site, the long-term management strategy recognizes the importance of views to the surrounding mountains, the role the hedges play in creating outdoor rooms for sculpture, and the form, color, and texture of the perennial garden. For the gardens at Vanderbilt Mansion, the emphasis is on perpetuating the tradition of garden craft and away from a practice of striving for a static planting plan. Changes based on water requirements, pests and diseases, and maturing vegetation are considered in character management. And these changes are acceptable. At Gettysburg National Military Park, an ambitious landscape rehabilitation project has been underway for more than a decade, and part of that calls for replanting 160 acres of orchards to reflect the conditions at the time of the battle. Based on interpretive objectives, the orchards are managed to achieve their historic spatial appearance rather than for fruit production as they were historically. So instead of historic varieties, semi-dwarf, disease-resistant varieties are planted, and the application of pesticides and other treatments will be minimized. The physical artifact is to help understand the strategy that impacted the battle, not on the specific historic varieties of fruit that were produced. And if we look at Cape Cod, we have a 1,500-acre dune shack historic district made up of simple vernacular landscape comprised of 19 wooden shacks within the dunes along the seashore. Based on this character, our focus is on perpetuating the use of the shacks as a remote inspirational retreat. Buildings will be preserved as close as possible to their historic character. However, modern materials will be allowed. Buildings may end up moving as they have historically, and more environmentally efficient utilities will be installed. A clear understanding of character sets up the framework for deciding how do we adapt to environmental changes. What are the best strategies for preservation that respond to those changes and incorporate sound environmental principles and management practices? At Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site in New York, our research documented rows of red pines that provided a screen from the pool and the stone cottage from the approach road. Over time, these were allowed to grow naturally, and the screen and the function of the screening was diminished. In 1986, we replaced the red pines in kind, because that was thought to be the best approach from a preservation standpoint. When we began our work in 2006 on a new project, we saw that the conditions in that replanted pine 20 years later suffered from the same effects. They had been thinned, they were not in good condition, and most importantly, they were not providing the function of a screen that was important to the historic character. To avoid this 20-year cycle, and especially in light of the fact that red pines are now vulnerable to a variety of diseases and pests, an alternative species, eastern red cedar, was chosen. It's a native species, it's found historically on the site, and it can produce the same dense screening that was there during the historic period. So it's a change, but it's a change that still evokes the character that we're trying to manage. We often modify historic conditions based on vulnerable natural systems. Back at Vanderbilt Mansion, historic vegetation included highly invasive species such as barberry and English ivy. So our treatment recommendations were not to replant these species, but to look at substitutions to prevent these from spreading into forests. Again, perpetuating character while protecting natural systems. A major issue when we look at our management in the national park system is in maintenance. We know we can reduce the impact of climate change by using environmental friendly practices in landscape maintenance. We're taking several steps to reduce the overall level of maintenance required and build a healthier, more self-sufficient system. Across the national park system, mowing turf grass is a significant source of greenhouse gas, as well as water usage, fertilizer, and herbicides. So solutions to reduce mowing are a big part of many of our ongoing discussions. Sometimes it can be fairly simple. At Glenmont, Thomas Edison's home in New Jersey, our research documented that historically, a large portion of what we mow today, which is over here, was actually a meadow, and it was maintained by grazing. So our solution was to reduce the maintained turf and to reintroduce the meadow. This was seen as a win-win since we are enhancing actually the historic character, bringing it back to what it was during Edison's time, while reducing mowing and lowering the carbon footprint in our maintenance practice. If we go across the coast to San Francisco, to Golden Gate National Recreation Area, there was a different strategy that's been taken for reducing mowing and irrigation. Historic Fort Baker has undergone a multi-million-dollar rehabilitation and is now home to Cavallo Point Lodge, which markets itself as an environmentally sustainable luxury resort hotel. Part of the project involved rehabilitation of the historic parade ground to reflect its historic character. However, the park and the lodge operator wanted to create a landscape that was a model of sustainability. In particular, reduce mowing, introduce native grass, eliminate eventually all irrigation. So a series of test plots were put in, look at the cover, growth, color of different seed mixes, both fully native seed mixes and a mix of native and non-native. And in particular, the color in the summer months when it would be browned out or golden was of particular concern. And a mix of native and non-native was selected, and here is the finished result. It gives you the character similar to the historic character. However, the mowing is reduced only a few times a year, and eventually, once it's fully established, the irrigation will no longer be used. And during the summer months, this is in the winter months, during the summer months, this parade ground will be a golden color. This approach is in keeping with landscape character, but it's slightly modified to address contemporary management goals. And again, that's acceptable. If we go across the bay, we can look at Fort Mason. At Fort Mason, once again, we defined where turf was appropriate in the historic core, and we looked at reducing turf in non-historic areas. This is called the Great Meadow. Our proposal was to eliminate 32% of the mown area and replace it with native grasses, drought tolerant. So basically to capture the gain in the non-historic zone while retaining the character in the historic zone. We also need to look at turf management and how we can incorporate organic turf in weed management practices, building a healthier soil community for long-term sustainability. There are places where it has changed rather dramatically. At Shenandoah National Historical Park, Rapidan Camp, which was Hoover's camp, was once characterized by its dense forest created by the hemlocks. Based on the woolly adelgid disease, the entire hemlock canopy has been lost, and what we were left with was this open meadow colonized by brush and invasive species. In consultation with park staff and forestry specialists, we've recommended not trying to reintroduce the hemlock, given the intervention that would be necessary and the treatment that would be necessary, but to allow the native pioneering yellow poplar trees to grow into a canopy. While the character is certainly different because of this deciduous plant, the character of a dense shaded area of the uniform tree will be reestablished, and you can see within 5 years already the effect that's being had. We also needed to take efforts to harden some of the shoreline to prevent the historic structures from being damaged during heavy rains for the river that runs along the camp. At Saratoga, we look at forest and field management patterns to reflect the time of the battle in 1777. We've identified areas where you should reforest, as well as areas here where the forest should be removed. And that was easy, if you will, to do in a planning exercise, but the real challenge is in deer, and the deer management, and in diseases and pests and invasive species, which are really significantly impacting the ability of the forest to regenerate over time. So we have a team of specialists coming together to develop a field and forest management plan that will consider all of these issues. And certainly our more recent storms have demonstrated clearly our greatest challenges are along the coast. What's the best strategy to preserve Liberty Island? And are there certain landscapes where we need to totally rethink the design, regardless of its historic significance? At Jacob Reese Park, which is a recreational area within Gateway National Recreation Area, wonderful 1930s recreational development by Robert Moses. Incredibly well used. It's one of the historic shots during its heyday. Storm damage has always been a part of the mix. This is a 1942 shot showing the results of cleaning up after a storm surge. Several years ago, we undertook a project to replace the historic railing. It was seen as a model of preservation because we were replicating the historic conditions using a durable material. Hurricane Sandy completely eliminated almost our investment. So the question becomes, should we rethink replicating historic conditions, and do we need a total new design that addresses this very vulnerable landscape in this context? The final point I'd like to make relates to caretaking. We have seen the extent of damage to cultural resources caused by events such as Hurricane Isabel, Hurricane Isaac, most recently Hurricane Sandy. But what we have also learned is that landscapes in good condition do better. They survive storm damages much better and cause much less damage. So we need to be investing in programs that put these landscapes in good condition so we can increase their resiliency. In closing, managing changing cultural landscapes has always been core to stewardship. However, the complexity of cultural resource management increases in the face of new environmental changes. While climate adaptation and landscape resilience historically have not been part of our terminology, they're not foreign concepts in preservation practice. In preservation terms, we use a lot of rehabilitation, is a term you will often hear. And rehabilitation is adaptation based on a variety of circumstances, such as contemporary use, accessibility, natural resource values, and long-term sustainability. So as we look forward to the future, cultural landscape stewardship will continue to approach treatment with the goal of attaining the highest degree of integrity and authenticity. However, we can anticipate that the management issues addressed will become greater and more complex. And as our environment continues to change, the financial resources continue to be stretched, the science and art of our practice must evolve, and forums such as this symposium really provide a great opportunity to explore how we can successfully respond to a changing environment in the context of our preservation mission. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Host lunch.
Wait a second, I'm sure there's one out there.
Oh, thank you.
You talked about a couple of win-win situations, but I can also imagine win-lose situations where the preservation of cultural landscapes in ways that make sense for, I don't know, resilience to storms or something might actually come into conflict with preservation of natural communities in those very same places. Do you have any examples like that?
Well, I think when we're looking, especially at Gateway, with all the work we're doing with with Sandy recovery, as it's going, we're going to make some pretty significant changes in those landscapes because of how vulnerable they are. We need the science to inform that. So what we use is we have the information. We know historically what the character was, what we would like to preserve, but the reality is, depending on how vulnerable it is, we really need to address those changes. So we may just be documenting what's there. That's the mitigation measure. It's our last resort, but in some cases, that may be the best approach for long-term sustainability, where we document for the record and we look at changes. And it's really a balancing act. All of what we do is balancing a whole host of factors. But I think along the coast, those are going to be the most intense conversations. And just on the win-win side, sometimes it's hard to sell the win. We really love mowing turf. That example at Edison, that was not popular with management to stop creating a beautiful lawn because we really love our lawns. So even though historically that was a better character and reflection, we're still kind of working on the sell to convert that to a meadow and to reduce the mowing. So we're not 100% there yet. Great, thanks.